Hi, this is Glenn Gibbert. I have a PhD in aerospace engineering. I've been working in that field for over 30 years. I'm going to do a follow-up to my previous posting, which is now going to be on COVID-19 prediction. So the previous one discussed more about the backgrounds of a particular model, which is the susceptible, infected, recovered model. This one will not focus nearly so much on that model, and if you want the details, at least on what I said on that, I'll put a link to that presentation in the description. And then there's plenty of places on the internet that you can also look and find out details on this model. This one's more going to talk about predictions in the immediate future and why we can feel that the predictions are fairly accurate at this point. So I'll go briefly over the model without going into any great detail. It is a differential equation, a relatively simple one actually, 3 equations. One talks about the amount of people that are susceptible and then getting infected with the disease. And so the number of people that are susceptible are designated by the letter S. The other section of the society is the people that are currently infected. So those people have come out of the susceptible group and now are no longer susceptible because they are infected. And then out of the infected group would be the people that are recovered. In this case means that they cannot get the disease again. The assumption of this model is it's the type of disease that you cannot get reinfected. And recovered then in that case means get well, but also if you died, you no longer can get the disease. So coming out of that group is also the people that died. Sometimes that's designated instead of recovered as removed, as in removed from the infected group. The model is the susceptible, infected, recovered model, and then often abbreviated to just the SIR model. Shown the pie graph there, at any given moment in the progression of this disease, there would be a certain number of people that are still susceptible and they could get the disease. There's a certain number of people that are currently infected, and then of the infected group, a certain number of people that are recovered, and that percentage would change as the disease progresses. There is a parameter that can be measured eventually. It's difficult to get early on, and that is some people that have the disease don't show symptoms and actually are not reported. For COVID-19, that number looks like it's somewhere around 5 to 1. That is, for every one person that's reported, there's somewhere around 4 to 9 people that didn't report. So they've had the disease. They actually would be in the susceptible group and then ultimately the recovered group, but they're just not reported. So for everything I'm going to predict here, I'm going to use the lower value of that and assume it's about a 5 to 1 ratio. So for every one person reported, there's another 4 people that had the disease, but essentially society and the models and the data don't know about. Originally, the COVID-19 looked like there was an R0 value of 1.8, and R0 is just simply the ratio of how quickly people are getting the disease over the amount of people that are recovering from the disease. And essentially, it, especially early on, tells you how quickly the disease is growing, and it gives the whole nature of the infiltration of the disease through society. So, and if you just march forward those differential equations that I showed on the previous chart, in time you get these charts that are shown in the figure. And had nothing have been done with an R0 value of 1.8, if Americans would have gone about their business doing nothing else, we would have expected somewhere near 239 million Americans to get the disease. Shouldn't be too surprising. That is the number of people then that also shows up in the recovered, because everybody that's susceptible will recover one way or the other, either by getting well or by dying. And remember too that there is this 5 to 1 ratio. So even if this number of 239 million would have gotten the disease, only about 1/5 of them we would have been aware of. So the reports would have been somewhere near 1/5 of that, or 45 million people. We would expect then that a certain percentage of people would have died. It's not clear exactly what that number is, but somewhere near maybe 1.5%. So taking into account the 5 to 1 ratio and the 1.5%, had nothing have been done, we would have expected about 750,000 Americans to have died from this disease. So the model, though, didn't predict that. The model shows that there was this early progression in the early part of 2020, but then instead of showing this exponential rise, instead it went sort of flat. And you can see here, plotted on here, is raw data in red, and the raw data is actually a little jiggly, so I smoothed it with a curve and just ran sort of a smooth curve through it, and that's shown in blue. And then the actual model that comes from the SIR model is shown in green. And you can see that the model here really nailed the data. It's right on top of it. And again, in the previous discussion, I mentioned the difference between the predicted amounts from February and what actually happened here. But it's not like the model was this perfect all along. There is sort of a method that I use to make this happen, and that is the generation and the changing of this R naught value. So day by day, as the disease progressed, I would look at the data and then I would alter the R naught value to note that the R naught value was changing. So remember, the denominator of the R naught value, the gamma, that's set by the disease, but the numerator, the beta value, is something that can be altered by social norms. And in this case, the beta was being altered by wearing your mask, by social distancing, by washing hands, and it did drop a lot. It went from a value of about 1.8 if nothing had happened, and that would have been about the 239 million Americans would have gotten the disease, but instead it dropped way down. Turns out if the R naught value gets near or below 1, then the disease then is really not progressing. It's just sort of, it'll actually start to die off in society if the R naught value gets below 1. So through these protocols, the U.S. did do quite well and brought the R naught value down to essentially 1, which means it wasn't seeing an exponential growth anymore. Instead, it was seeing a linear growth. And now as the U.S. starts opening up through phase 1, phase 2, different regions of the country are doing different timings for that. But you can see the R naught value is creeping up a little bit. And just to give you a feel, again, for what happens here, had nothing have been done, and R naught value stayed at about 1.8 back in February, we would have expected about 239 million cases in the U.S. When it dropped down to nearly its minimum, which is about 1.03, would have expected about 25 million cases, and then going up to an R naught of about 1.1, we'd expect about 53 million cases. You can see how sensitive the whole process is to this R naught value, and really how sensitive it is then to these social protocols of wearing masks and washing hands and things like that. But probably the most important thing out of this whole graph is this curve is now finally sort of flattening out. And so there's still some wiggling, some variations, and that can change the result, but we can see that it's almost flat and it's an R naught value of about 1.13. So that means it was tough to predict what was going on in March and April and all that, because the R naught value was changing a lot. But now for the whole U.S., it looks like it's about a 1.13. So the models would indicate that from here on out, we should be able to predict stuff pretty well. Now, if things change, if all of a sudden everybody starts hugging each other and not wearing masks and doing stuff, then the R naught value will grow, and of course things will change. But if we assume that society across the country stays about the same, this R naught value would be about a 1.13. What does that mean? Well, if we look at these other curves with a value now of R naught of 1.127, I actually went another decimal place over, we would see that there would be a peak in about the first week of August of people that are actually infected with the disease of about 1.45 million. But remember, there's this 5-to-1 ratio. So the actual number of people reported being sick on that day would be about would be that value divided by 5. And then total amount of people that would get the disease in the U.S. is somewhere near about 64 million would get it, but reported would be about 1/5 of that amount, so somewhere around 12 million or so. Largely the disease progressing through the U.S. and being done by essentially in December of 2020. I think that's what we can expect. But again, the reported number at the end of all this will be 1/5 of 64 million. And of course, this doesn't include if a vaccine gets developed anytime sooner than that or anything like that. Florida is actually a little bit more interesting. Florida's data is the same sort of methodology. I live in Florida. Florida's R naught value started off like the U.S. at about 1.75. It dropped way down. It was spectacularly low early on, and then it's been growing back up, and a little bit more difficult to predict where it's actually settling out. As a matter of fact, it kind of looks like there's still this upward trend even from here, but it also sort of looks like it could be flattening. So the Florida predictions are a little bit more challenging than the whole U.S. And again, it's sort of similar. You can tie these changes in the R naught value and essentially what people were doing that altered the social behaviors. And then also this is, Florida has about 22 million people in it. And so had the R-naught value stayed as low as 0.97, extremely low value, would have expected about 390,000 cases. And now the R-naught value is closer to a 1.25. And if that's the case, there would be about 7.3 million cases in Florida. A little tougher to say what Florida is actually ending up on, but it looks pretty close. And I would say the value for the R-naught is about a 1.18. And so what does that mean? Well, if it's 1.18, we would expect just a little bit less than 6 million Americans, 6 million Floridians to get the disease. So again, reported would only be 1/5 of that, but we would expect about 6 million people to get it, and so 1.2 million people reported if the R-naught is 1.8. But maybe kind of important here is suppose it's off, and suppose it goes to the higher value that we saw in the previous chart. If the R-naught value is a 1.25, then we'd expect about 7.5 million Floridians to get the disease, or another 1.5 million above and beyond, even a relatively small value that we saw the R-naught value was. And then if we go to the lower bounds, I don't think Florida is going to be able to get an R-naught value less than 1.14. So it seems like if that's the value, then it'd be somewhere right around 1 million Floridians would get the disease. I put back on this chart the R-naught value to show just how subtly these R-naught values are changing, but what a big impact it has on the total number of people that get it. Something that you can use to check me on is the daily reported cases in Florida. So I'm predicting, according to this model, if the R-naught value is 1.18, and that is my best estimate of what I think it's going to be sort of on an average from here on out, then somewhere early in August, somewhere around August 9th, I believe is the day, the news would report 17,500, where there's actually, I would expect 5 times more now in this case of actual cases, but what actually will get reported will be the 17.5 thousand people. And that has a fair amount of range on it. If it's an R-naught value of 1.25, then that number could be as high as 27,000 reported early August. And if it's as low as an R-naught value of 1.14, then there would be about 14,000 reported on that day. That's it. That's my predictions here. I think the important part is, even though the models have been a little bit tenuous until now, but because that R-naught value is settling in on essentially one number, from here on out, we can probably expect the predictions to be better. There's still a model, so it's not going to be perfect, but it should be better. So thank you for watching. Next week, I am not going to talk about COVID-19. So thank you very much.